June 2000. The United Nations Security Council is in session. Iraq's oil minister stands up and makes an announcement so small, so procedural, that most of the room barely reacts. Iraq will no longer accept US dollars for its oil. From now on, euros only. A few diplomats exchange glances. Some journalists file minor stories. The financial press gives it maybe 3 paragraphs. And Washington says almost nothing publicly. 3 years later, Iraq was invaded. Now, was that a coincidence? Maybe. There were weapons of mass destruction claims, post-9/11 pressure, unfinished business from 1991. The official reasons filled entire press conferences. But here's what nobody put in the briefing. The moment Iraq switched to euros, it didn't just change its payment currency. It pulled a thread on the most powerful financial system ever constructed. A system so invisible, so deeply embedded in global trade that most people living inside it have never once heard its name. To understand what Iraq actually did, we need to go back. Not to 2000, not even to 1990. We need to go to 1971. August 15th, Nixon goes on television, interrupts a Sunday night program, and tells the world that the United States is suspending the convertibility of dollars.
Henry Kissinger flew to Saudi Arabia with an offer the kingdom couldn't refuse. Your oil, our dollars. The full arrangement was slightly more elegant than that. Saudi Arabia would sell its oil exclusively in US dollars. The surplus dollars it accumulated, the ones it couldn't possibly spend domestically, would be recycled back into US Treasury bonds, American banks, American financial markets. And in return, America would arm Saudi Arabia, protect Saudi Arabia, station military assets in the region, and make it very clear to anyone with territorial ambitions in the Gulf that touching Saudi Arabia meant touching the United States. Saudi Arabia said yes. The smaller OPEC members followed within a year. And just like that, the dollar had its new anchor. Not gold, oil. If you wanted oil, you needed dollars first. And since every country on Earth needed oil, every country on Earth needed dollars. Constantly, permanently. There was no opt-out. Economists called it an exorbitant privilege, which is the polite academic way of saying America found a way to make the rest of the world fund its spending, indefinitely. For decades, it worked exactly as designed. By the 1990s, the dollar accounted for over 70% of global reserves. US Treasury bonds were the world's favorite safe asset. America could run deficits that would have bankrupted any other country and simply export the inflation to everyone else holding dollars. It was, by any honest measure, the most successful financial architecture in human history. And Saddam Hussein looked at all of this and decided he was going to dismantle it with a press release. To understand Saddam's logic, you have to understand what Iraq had. Second largest proven oil reserves in OPEC, roughly 112 billion barrels sitting under the desert. Production capacity that fully unlocked could rival Saudi Arabia itself. And Saddam had a grievance. The sanctions imposed after the Gulf War had devastated Iraq's economy. The Oil for Food program, which allowed Iraq to sell limited oil in exchange for humanitarian goods, was denominated in dollars. Dollars that lost value while the sanctions were running. Dollars that Saddam believed were being deliberately devalued to squeeze his government. So in November 2000, Iraq made the switch. All oil sales through the UN Oil for Food program would now be settled in euros. On the day of the announcement, the euro was worth about 82 cents. By early 2002, it had climbed past parity.
Because what Iraq had just demonstrated was something the architects of the petrodollar system had spent 30 years praying nobody would demonstrate publicly. The system was optional. Not legally binding, not enforced by any international treaty, just a web of economic incentives, military relationships, and unstated understandings. And if one country, a major oil producer, could simply announce it was stepping outside the web, other countries might start asking why they couldn't do the same. Iran was watching. Venezuela was watching. Russia, just beginning its own oil export boom under a former KGB officer named Vladimir Putin, was watching. The precedent was the threat, not Iraq's actual euro-denominated oil sales, which were a relatively small slice of global markets. The precedent. What happens when you break the precedent? March 20th, 2003, coalition forces crossed the Iraqi border. The official justifications were weapons of mass destruction, links to terrorism, liberation of the Iraqi people from a brutal dictator. And some of those arguments had genuine supporters. Not everyone who backed the invasion was cynical. Some genuinely believed the intelligence. Some genuinely wanted Saddam gone for reasons that had nothing to do with oil pricing mechanisms. But watch what happened on day one of the occupation.
The oil ministry was secured. Not the hospitals, not the museums, not the power infrastructure. The oil ministry. American forces stood guard outside while the rest of Baghdad descended into looting. The National Museum lost 15,000 artifacts. Hospitals were stripped, electrical substations destroyed. The oil ministry did not lose a single document. And when the new Iraqi government was eventually stood up, its first major economic act was to return all oil sales to US dollar pricing. The Euros experiment lasted exactly as long as Saddam did. You could call that a coincidence. And there are serious historians who argue the petrodollar motive is overstated. The Iraq War had enough causes to fill a library. But consider the pattern. In 2009, Muammar Gaddafi proposed something bigger. Not just switching Libya's oil to a different currency, an entire gold-backed African currency, the gold dinar. 40 African nations pooling their gold reserves to create a new monetary system for the continent. One that would free African oil and commodity exports from dollar dependency entirely. Libya held 143 tons of gold. Gaddafi spent years building the coalition. In 2011, NATO intervened in Libya's civil war. Gaddafi was captured and killed. The gold dinar proposal died the same day. His gold reserves were never publicly accounted for. Venezuela.
Now here's the question you're probably asking. Does this mean every conflict involving an oil-rich country is secretly about the dollar? No, that's too simple, too clean. Real history is messier than that. Saddam was genuinely dangerous. Gaddafi was genuinely brutal. Maduro genuinely destroyed his country's economy. Each conflict had its own combustible mix of legitimate grievances, domestic politics, regional instability, and strategic calculation. But the pattern asks a specific question that the official explanations never quite answer. Why these countries? Why these timelines? Why, in every single case, did oil pricing return to dollars within months of regime change? Coincidence requires you to believe the dog keeps finding the bone by accident. And here's where it gets interesting for 2026. Because the experiment Iraq tried in 2000, the one that ended badly, it's being run again. Except this time by countries large enough that the United States cannot simply invade its way out of the problem. China has been systematically reducing its U.S. Treasury holdings from a peak of $1.3 trillion to roughly $600 billion. It has been buying gold instead, aggressively, consistently, for years. Russia and China now settle significant portions of their bilateral trade in yuan and rubles. India has paid for Russian oil in rupees. Brazil and China have struck currency swap agreements that bypass the dollar entirely. And Saudi Arabia, the country that made the original deal with Kissinger in 1974, publicly stated in 2023 that it was open to selling oil in currencies other than the dollar. The dollar still dominates 88% of foreign exchange transactions, roughly half of all global trade invoicing. No single rival comes close to replacing it. But the question Iraq asked in 2000 is now being asked simultaneously by a dozen major economies. And the answer this time is harder to bomb away.
The empire Iraq challenged wasn't built on military force alone. It was built on a simple, elegant piece of circular logic. Countries need oil. Oil requires dollars.